Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on ESG data sourcing and management to meet your ESG strategy, objectives and timelines. My name is Sarah Underwood. I'm an editor here at 18 Group and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I'd just like to share with you some events we've got coming up, and you can see and sign up for them at the bottom of the page. On June the 20th, we'll host our first AICM Artificial AI and Capital Markets Summit in London. On the 26th of September, we'll be in New York City for our next Data Management Summit. And you can also sign up for our 18th of July webinar on how to maximize the use of data standards and identifiers beyond compliance and the interests of the business. So if those are of interest to you, please feel free to sign up. But more importantly, let's get back to today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Arya Guzari, Senior Vice President, Head of ESG Data at Neuberger Berman, Neil Sandwell, Chief Product Officer at Alveo, and Angel Aguda, Board Director and Senior Vice President of Product at Clarity AI. I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first just a few hints and tips for you. We're running Slido today, and you'll see two channels panels perhaps beside the video. One is for poll questions. We'll be running 3 today, so do please take part in those as they come up. I'll let you know. And in the other panel, that is one for your questions that you would like to put to the speakers. So please add your questions when you would like to, and we'll answer as many as we go along, or at least further down the webinar. But so just add those when you're ready. Okay, enough of me. And let me ask our speakers to introduce themselves. Arya, coming to you first, please tell us a little bit about your interest here.
Sure. So Arya Guzari, head up ESG data and reporting globally at Neuberger Berman. Reason why I'm here for ESG and data, two passionate topics of mine. I think in one of my posts I mentioned that we get like over 2 billion data points just from one vendor. So I think it's a very important topic to try and address, and I'm pretty sure we're not the only firm that's going through these pain points. So always happy to share our pain points with others, because you never know who it might resonate with the most.
Okay, lovely, thank you. Neil.
Hi there, Neil Sandwell, Chief Product Officer for Alveo. Really excited to be here. ESG is forming a really important part of our customers' data challenges in the landscape, whether that's through regulatory reporting or sourcing. So it's a really important aspect of data that we aggregate for our customers.
Thank you very much indeed. And Angel.
Hello, everybody. I'm Angel Agudo, in charge of product at Clarity AI. Maybe let's start with a kind of a fun fact. So we started Clarity back in 2017. So technology and artificial intelligence to facilitate the inclusion of sustainability in decision making. And we named the company Clarity for that reason, because the fact about being able to provide clarity on the data and to be able to use ESG data and information into the processes of the organizations was the essence of what we were trying to solve.
Okay, thank you. So lots of experience and expertise in the room. Let's get started, and let's do that with a poll question. It asks, how much progress has your organization made on ESG data sourcing and management? And while you answer the question, let me come back to Arya to talk a little bit about how he sees the state of play on ESG data.
Yeah, so I don't think any of the stuff that I'm about to mention is new. So we've all heard it's the wild west of data. It's consistently evolving. For me, it puts big data into perspective, not so much from a frequency of the snapshot, so not like credit card transactions, but the sheer volume of data points currently, and also new data points are evolving. But I think the biggest change that I've seen, certainly since the boom, or the 2020/2021 boom that we had, I think it's definitely refined as a product. So I've seen better quality of the data, more structured services around ESG data. So from my perspective, as a consumer of this data, it's definitely helped with the choices that I have available to me.
Okay, that sounds good. Angel, what would you add there?
Yeah, I agree with Aria that I believe the situation has been improving across the years. As I just mentioned, we started the company back in 2017, but even in my previous career, I was working on data related to sustainability topics from the 2010 or so. So this has evolved a lot. Still, and maybe to start with some positive ideas around this, what we see is more standardization, so regulations, frameworks, the adoption of many of those ones are helping a lot on ensuring that the information is more standard. And maybe as well the interest and the engagement and commitment of companies, financial institutions, and in general players in the economy and the society, because there are more pressure about the scrutiny and being able to show the reality of what they need to report. Maybe on the bad side or more negative side of the story, I think I can quote a survey that was done by Bloomberg, indeed already in this year, 2024, where they named that already 63% of the European ESG funds or ESG financial institutions, they consider that they still have challenges around the quality on ESG data. And it's basically because it's complex. So the positive side of the regulation is that the standardization is growing, but on the other side, there are more metrics, more dimensions, more requests to the companies to report, and that forces them to pay more attention to all the nuances, the characteristics of the metrics, etc., etc. And I guess we're going to be talking about those ones during the day today.
I'm sure we shall be. Meantime, though, may we see those poll results? And Angel, perhaps you'd like to comment here. Yeah, pretty much what you were talking about. What would you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's aligned with what we were saying, right? So there's been a good progress, and funny enough, the 60-something% of people still believe that there are challenges, which is more or less aligned with what we see here. So good progress, but still work to be done.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed for voting to our audience, and thank you, Angel. And let's bring you in, Neil, now if I can. And with no constraints, what would optimal ESG data and data management look like? Just however you can imagine it.
Yeah, I think so. It's really important to consider ESG not in isolation, but consider it as part of the whole market data requirement for a business. So being centralizing, not only ESG, but your security master and your entity structure around that. One of the key points that we see at customers is, the ability to ensure that you can trace this data, having the ability to see, back to source where this data came from and being able to aggregate this data as well. And as Angel mentioned, there are challenges with the data. The data is continuously evolving, but documentation of how the data appears for an end user and the gaps that it has is a really significant part. But when you're looking at data management, as we've said, there are multiple vendors out there. There are more attributes being added all the time. It's important to ensure that when you're looking at data management, that you can source and onboard this data incredibly quickly. And that is a key component when thinking about your data management solution, I would argue.
Okay, fine. That sounds pretty practical. Angel, is there a bigger world out there that looks like the perfect solution?
I try to list the characteristics that this data management perfect solution would look like. And for me, there are 4 big things that would be included there. And the first one, I agree with Neil. It could be about the capability to mix different sources of data. So as well, recent surveys about especially financial institutions, which are one of the players that we work with the most, they name the importance of getting information from different providers, since the topic is complex and you might need to combine different universe of investment and so on. So the capabilities to mix those providers in one single place is essential to be a good data management solution. The second dimension is about ensuring quality. And on that, I believe that even though I agree with Neil on the idea that it's another type of data, so you need to rely on your systems and you need to consider ESG data as part of all the rest of the data that you use. At the same time, there are nuances that are very relevant about the topic. So the capability to manage the methodological side, the expertise on why this metric is measured this way, etc., is relevant. And that is something that the system needs to take into consideration, the methodological layer that is, in this case, very specific to the ESG topic in particular. Third one is about security. The more that you involve different sources, or even if you include your proprietary data or you include proprietary data coming from other pieces, might make this information more confidential, and you need to be safe on ensuring that you have the right resources to take care of the confidentiality of the data and avoiding potential issues related to that. And the fourth one, which is the essence of why do you want to have all this data, is on the analytical capabilities. So on top of this system, what you need to do is to be able to transform all that data into information. That is the one that is going to help you make the right decisions. So those four to me are the ones that compose the perfect.
Okay, fine. And Aria, as a practitioner, what is the perfect scenario for you?
I just have two asks. I want one single entity used across every single exchange, data provider, custodian, investment platform, clients, asset managers. That's consistent across ESG data, fundamental data, credit data. And then I guess my second simple ask is, the different vendors, they have a different naming convention for each field. Ideally, they all become one standard uniform identifier so that, as consumers of the data, I want scope 1 from all these 17 different vendors. I just have to make reference to one tag. So they're my two simple asks. Okay.
We'll be talking about some of those things later and hopefully pointing the direction slightly towards them, but let's see. But first, let's run another audience poll. And this one asks, what are the challenges of sourcing and managing ESG data at your organization? Please answer this one and feel free to tick as many of the boxes as are appropriate to your organization. There's quite a long list, but I'm sure there are things that I've missed out and that our speakers will catch me up on. So while you do that, let me come back to Aria and talk about the reality of the challenges and sourcing and managing ESG data and how these differ from sourcing and managing market data and perhaps ref data.
Yeah, so again, it's not new information, but there is a lot of data. I think if you're not focused and specific in your sourcing, you're just going to drown in all the data that's available. I always encourage people to start small, start very specific, know exactly the type of information that you're after, and then go and focus on that data set. Once you become familiar with it, then you start to ask different questions that you never knew were questions to begin with when you first started the journey. So again, I come back to this 2020, 2021, when we first started formally sending out this type of information to PMs and clients. The questions being asked back then versus the questions that we're now getting, you can tell users are more sophisticated, they're a lot more mature, they better understand the data set, and this is purely as a result of starting small, starting basic, getting very familiar with the data set, and then going from there. The other thing that I always would encourage, you really need to think through your architecture. So you need to check that you're sourcing correctly, you're verifying when you're pushing it out. Like all of these need to be addressed before you start just adding on a new data set just because, I want this new type of metric and it's going to solve this other new problem that I have. But actually, if you haven't got as any analogy, if you haven't got the right foundations, the whole building's going to crumble before you. So it's very important for me, I stopped adding new data vendors and actually want to refocus on establishing the ESG data strategy. And to me, I'll touch on that later on, what that means to me. It's obviously going to mean different things to other people, but I can touch on that later. The other big thing, and again, I joked about it, but actually entity mapping is a big part. So you want to make sure that when you have multiple vendors, you're able to link the data sets between them. That serves two purposes. One, tying into your existing. So I think Angel mentioned the proprietary information. You want to pull that through, right? You want that's why that's the alpha generation. You want to make sure that it ties into the different entities that you have. But secondly, it allows you to do some other funky stuff like, systematic data quality checks with multiple vendors. So this is where understanding the entities relationships between different vendors can be applied in practice. Then once you have all this information pulled into your investment systems, so you need to then make sure that it's correctly displaying with the data sets that you have there, the reporting platforms that you have. Then you can start looking at once it's embedded, okay, now I have all this information, what's the implications on DQ, so your data quality. So again, I'll touch on that in my next bit. But how this differs to traditional data sets, the biggest feedback is like there is just so much and so much new data that typically with your reference or credit data, how many new different variations of the name, CEDAW, a ratio do you have versus, oh, let's figure out a new biodiversity data set for a specific company that never existed before. Like it's very different. And also in terms of suppliers of data, like typically with your fundamental reference data and ratings data, you don't have as many players versus ESG data providers. So we saw a massive influx of new ESG data providers purely because of reduced barrier to entry. Anyone with NLP or AI for in colloquial terms can pull through information, scrape it, and now publish that. Whereas with fundamental data, you need credibility. You need people to trust that, I'm giving this rating for the risk assessment, so you can therefore trust me. Whereas kind of different on the ESG side, you're publishing what's already been reported in client reports in CSR publications.
Okay, thank you. Neil, what do you experience in terms of the challenges that customers are facing when you're out there in the market?
It's kind of interesting. So, I kind of echo Ara's point. What we're seeing is a lot of customers coming to us with a number of providers that they want to use for specific subsets of data. Whether that's biodiversity data, pay data, it doesn't really make a difference. They're using specific vendors for specific data sets. And that's kind of creates challenges around being able to map data between the various different sources of data. There are less standards in ESG data in terms of reporting intervals as well. And what we're seeing is customers looking at building their own scores and ratings, using the base layer of the ESG data provided because of the lack of low correlation between them to actually build their own internal models around the ESG as well. And just to echo, the entity always pops up. What level of reporting do I want that? Is it consistent across my organization? And making sure you can bring up the ESG data to the correct level throughout your organization is one of the key challenges that we see too.
Okay, fine. That's great. Thank you both very much. If we maybe see the poll results, please. And Neil, you might like to comment there on those again. A lot about what we've been talking about. I see the issues of time quite low down there. They used to, I think, a little bit higher up. What would you say to those results?
I would say they're not surprising. I think we've alluded to the fact there is an incredible amount of unstructured, large data sets from multiple different standards, multiple different vendors that create a lot of the challenges that we see at our customer bases. And I think we've mentioned it time and time again about comparing different data sets. And what's really surprising, I think, is that I would expect the poor quality of data to actually be higher up. And that does surprise me. But we do see customers really focusing on the multiple data sets and the flexibility of onboarding. So this doesn't surprise me at all.
Okay. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for voting. And let's move on. In some of these challenges, we've sort of pointed to some of the solutions, but let's sort of comment on those and make very clear how firms can resolve these kinds of challenges and source and manage data for ESG strategy objectives. So we've touched on many of the problems and some of the solutions. Coming to you, Angel, could you kind of wrap that up and share that with us?
Yeah, I think as you said, some of the interesting topics have been mentioned that maybe we can deep dive a little bit. And indeed, I would follow up what Arya just mentioned about the strategy and the importance of the definition of the strategy of what is exactly what you want to do. And typically, I would say, so one key dimension is the pure reporting purposes. So what you want to do is to put in place that information to be consumed outside. Even there, I feel like it's important to understand who is going to be consuming that information. So it's going to be for regulatory purposes where you're going to comply with the specific regulations. It's going to be because what you want to do is to attract capital, and you need to be well exposed to financial institutions, in which case they need to understand very well what you are doing, or any other stakeholders that, as we know now, in order to have suppliers, providers, even clients, this information is used more and more to define those type of relationships. So you need to understand very well exactly how that is going to be defined. That might be more on the external side, but of course it needs to be crucial as well on the internal side. This needs to help you to define your own strategy about how you want to improve your key dimensions on sustainability. And in that case, something that, for example, we provide to corporates on the benchmarking side, we believe is essential. You need to be able to compare yourself against other companies within your industry, outside your industry, etc. Because one of the challenges that we see is that typically many of these dimensions are purely absolute numbers. And sometimes it's challenging for the organizations to understand what does it mean, because in reality, what is going to make the difference is what is your position in your industry with this type of metrics, and how you can improve in order to get to a certain percentile or to get to a certain position in the market. How to do that? Once you have defined those strategies, absolutely clear, you need to leverage technology in order to do that. And as I said before, the specific challenge around ESG and sustainability is that technology is not necessarily enough, but a specific knowledge, context, understanding of sustainability dimensions is essential, because you need to understand how to combine and use the data. So combining both, using the technology that you might have with other systems, CRMs, ERPs, etc., that helps you to put all the information together, but ensuring that you have a layer that lets you translate that into what is relevant for you based on your strategy. I believe both are key in order to approach the ESG sustainability data management in the right way.
Okay, thank you. And coming back to Arya, you obviously have to do this in the real every day. How do you challenge some of those? How do you resolve some of those challenges we've talked about?
Yeah, so I touched on actually having an ESG data strategy. It can be similar to your other data strategies, but again, we've already touched on how the ESG data sets specifically are quite different. So I would encourage you to have a subset strategy specific for ESG. Now, to me, it's not some like big bulky document that everyone has to adhere to, and you have to set, a 5, 10, 15-year strategy. No, to me, it's something that at least has a guide, a rough North Star of the direction and the approach that we want to take. Everyone is aware of the position, what are our priorities. So to me, it's a living document. It's a practical document. Again, the term strategy can mean different things to different people, but how we're approaching it here is, we're starting small. We're not boiling the ocean. Again, like if you try and like look at every single ESG data point that exists, you won't get anything done. So for me, I started with, okay, what are the core CDs, critical data elements. So to me, how I did that, looking at client reports, what are we using in our proprietary models? Now, all of a sudden, I have a list that I need to focus on. Then taking those fields and then mapping out to, okay, how do I ensure that they're being populated timely, the coverage is good. I have some basic quality checks. So, again, start simple. Okay, what's the move between last period and this period? Has it exceeded an arbitrary threshold? Only once you start to see the data, see the flags, then you can start to refine. Okay, actually now I'm only interested if actually, scope 1 moves by 63% instead of 60%. Like, I mean, that's what will happen once you start to play with the data. And the next thing, which will probably go against some of your sponsors, is don't buy straight away. Prototype internally. It's going to allow you to understand where your pain points are. If you can do it manually, then you can really understand what you need to solve for, what you don't need to solve for, and then use that to go search, right? Because one, you would be more focused in your searching efforts. You know exactly what you want and what you don't want from your vendors, and the vendors will appreciate it a hell of a lot more versus if you're very vague in what you're trying to solve for. So it's a win-win from that perspective, and you're going to get a lot more from that exercise. So there are a couple of points that we apply in practice.
That's good. Thank you very much indeed. Let's just touch on the regulatory side if we can, Angel, and how can firms ensure compliance with the ESG obligations that seem to double every other week? It's a very changing landscape, but it's hard to comply with any of these regulations, and this is particularly difficult. How can firms manage this?
Yeah, I would just mention one point coming from the previous question that, as I mentioned, so we definitely on our side, we value a lot when clients have clear ideas on what they want, especially from the product perspective, because sometimes it's very challenging to ensure that you cover the needs of clients that have unclear goals or unclear strategies. So this is something that we have seen growing a lot across time. So more and more companies have more clear definitions of how and what they want to get out of that. But definitely in the early days, it was pretty challenging. So on the compliance on the ESG obligations coming from the regulation, one thing that is a reality is that firms more and more of any nature, they need to get used to that because there are growing regulations that are extending the scope of companies that are obligated to report this information. We traditionally had the non-financial regulatory directive on the European side that is moving to the CSRD, to the CSDDD. So more and more regulations are giving more attention or asking companies to report this type of information. Maybe a couple of points coming from that. One is the unit of analysis. While traditionally these directives or these regulations were focused only on the operations of the companies, the level of analysis is growing. And we see with the CSDDD that now the supply chain is relevant as well. So it's not only you that you need to take into consideration your dimensions, but as well your supply chain that you need to account to. So very relevant to be sure that you are compliant with the regulation is that you have track records of the organizations that you are interacting in order to comply with the new directives. Same thing happens as well with the CSRD, where it's not just important that you report the pure information, but as well that you do your own assessment about what is material, because we don't need to forget that this information is relevant for different purposes. It might be because you want to do things better for the world, for the society, but also from the risk management perspective. You need to understand what are the dimensions that are more material for you. And in order to do that, you need to understand the nature of this information, why it's relevant to your business, why it's not. In both cases, once you compile the information for yourself, for your supply chain, about the data, about the materiality, one thing that we have seen especially relevant is ensure the quality and the consistency of that information. And maybe I can bring here a fact coming from a research that we did in collaboration with CDP, a very well-known brand associated to climate information disclosure, where we found that 1 out of 5 companies exhibited different numbers in their public reports versus the information that they were disclosing to CDP. Clearly, there was a big challenge for the organizations or being able to understand very well what they were disclosing and being able to translate it into different requirements in the market when they were asked about a small change in the definition of the metric. So there is where we believe companies need to pay special attention as well, ensuring this idea of the accuracy, the quality, the consistency of the data is right, so they can be assessed with one single number across the market.
Okay, fine. I think this one is going to roll on and roll on as the regulations change, expand, become more jurisdictional and so on. But thank you for that. We touched on this again, but let me come back first to you, Aria, and talk a little bit about the kinds of technologies and tools and solutions and services that are helpful here. You mentioned briefly AI earlier. Perhaps you'd like to add that to your solutions list.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll only focus on tools and tech right up until data usage, because again, we're going to have like another conversation on the tools we use for reporting, etc. So there are some providers that help you aggregate the data. So that pain point that I mentioned of like multiple different vendors having different vendors IDs. So there are some companies that can actually help you to aggregate, have it in one platform, and then you consume that within your processes. Another solution that they can offer is they do some level of data quality checks. So that could cover like, the vendor has changed methodologies. That obviously has a knock-on effect. Or they've changed the architecture in the data files. That's definitely going to have a knock-on effect. So the biggest theme that you hear from a conversation is you need to try and shift away from like these not so value add functions that an asset manager would have, and shift that to tools that can do that and focus their attention on that. You need to focus your attention on, now that I have good data I can work with, how can I use that to add value to my clients for the firm and for the wider objectives of, why are we doing this in the first place, which is obviously the ESG objectives that we have. So that's always the principle behind any decision in terms of tools and tech to use. Other tools that are quite useful. So again, the biggest themed topic, AI. I hate it when people use general models to try and assist them with these very specific use cases, right? So, you can't expect OpenAI, ChatGPT to kind of give you good results and good outcomes when you're trying to feed it ESG specific information. So if you really want to take it to the next level, go and look at models that allow you to train on specific data, specific reports, specific ESG reports, TCFD reports, any other report that you're after, and then use that information. Okay, so I think tools that allow you to do that, when there are tools you can buy, a lot of startups that allow you to customize the LLMs for the specific purpose. That's when you're really going to get the ROI, and you're going to see the results. Because first try, you try and use ChatGPT, you get the wrong. You shelve it. You're like, it doesn't work. I'm not going to use it anymore. But actually, if you try an alternative route, you will see the benefits. So in practice, how do you use this? Data quality checks, right? You can't keep hiring people to scale your data quality, right? You need to leverage AI in this case, and this is the perfect example of how you can leverage AI to assist you in performing those DQ. Other cases could be like summarizing data that you need. So I'm trying to source specific information. How do I make sure that I can put in my reports accurately? These are tools that you have now that we didn't have even 3 years ago at the broader level, unless you had millions and millions of pounds for IBM Watson. So I won't get to the names of the tools, but these are like the general tools that are out there that exist that can help you, and especially on the data quality. So there are some tools that allow you to analyze discrepancies and tell you, I've noticed a discrepancy or an anomaly. Focus on these points.
Okay, that's tremendous. Thank you very much indeed. Angel, coming to you, where do you see some of the best solutions and so on? I know probably coming from your company, but what's needed?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been dedicating a lot of effort for the last years on improving this. And I agree with Aria on the fact that even though it might look like now everything is simple, it's still very, very complex due to many of the reasons that we have mentioned before: the lack of standardization, the complexity of the frameworks, how fast they are changing, etc. So the type of technologies that we have been using, definitely the hot topic of AI and machine learning technologies that we have been applying on the data collection side. But as we mentioned, being sure that you can systematically and automatically gather that information, collect that information is still a challenge. I like to mention maybe just a couple of examples. So one with a metric that is pretty common that is about the women on board, the gender diversity on board of directors of organizations. And when you have a look at sustainability reports and how companies report and disclose this information, you can find that the number that you're looking for is typically a percentage. The way that they expose that information is tremendously different. So in some cases, you find the list of names. In some cases, you have just numbers of men and women. When you have the names, you need to understand what is the gender, because you might have those names coming from any different culture, countries, etc. Just the intelligence of trying to translate that into a single final number, which is the information that you're going to use, is not straight away at all, and it deserves very much fine-tuning, as Arya was mentioning. We have been using that technology as well to cover gaps. So typically the companies don't report everything, and they choose in many cases what they want to report, what they don't. Now regulations force them to be more standard on that, but still you see many gaps, especially if you want to do historical views, and historical analysis is essential for certain teams. In that case, being able to estimate those data points and having enough information to take into consideration as much dimensions of the companies as you can to be sure that those estimates are accurate is something that we provide and we use as well to be able to have a comprehensive view. And maybe on AI, the last point on the generative AI dimension, which is this fact that as Arya was mentioning, the improvement in efficiency and time dedication to do things much faster is crucial, and it's something that we can provide. But as we were mentioning, so it's very important that you do it with the right tools, with the right players, to ensure that you are not getting to the wrong conclusions or the wrong insights.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's take a break and take some audience questions. We have quite a few that have come in. And Neil, if I can come to you first. This one asks, ESG is a challenge. How can firms gain operational efficiency when sourcing and managing ESG data? I think this probably comes from someone who, like you, agrees there's an awful lot of data. How can they achieve some operational efficiency?
Well, I think, well, firstly, understanding, the sources of data that you want to consume, and, determining what your target operating model is going to be really important. As many of the members have mentioned, the ability to kind of take that and standardize that into something that's kind of more of a golden copy is going to be really important, and having that flexibility in the rules to generate what I would class as a consistent source across this is going to be really where you're going to focus. There are different tags, there are different values that are supplied by each of the vendors, and also different subsets of data. That's, to me, is where the focus needs to be.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And here comes another question. This one is, I'm going to put this one to you, Angela, if I might. It's something that you may or may not know the answer to. I don't, so let's have a go. It says, how do you see the value of fixed income ESG ratings data alongside traditional risk ratings?
Yeah, so I believe that there's an evolution across time, as Neil was mentioning before, moving from the ratings to the real understanding of the data that is behind. Indeed, I started my conversation today talking about this idea of clarity and the importance of clarity, because is very challenging to understand only coming from a high level rating, the reality that is behind the organization. Let me give you some numbers. So in our ESG risk tree analysis, we include more than 350 dimensions across the 3 pillars: environmental, social, governance, that, by the way, themselves, they are like pretty different from each other. So it's very challenging to assume that you're going to be able to summarize absolutely everything in one just single number. What we believe we need to provide, and it doesn't matter if you are talking about equity investment or fixed income or the approach that you want to follow, is that you need to go beyond that and you need to get to the level of granularity that lets you understand what is exactly going on with the company. If the approach is a risk assessment, you need to understand what are the topics that the companies might be exposed to, how material they are for them, and how the company is evolving across time, if they have defined the right policies, if they are improving across time on those dimensions and so on. That is something that cannot be done with just a single rating, but with a much more fundamental analysis on what is behind.
Okay, thank you. And Aria, a question especially for you. It asks, please don't mention the tools as you mentioned before, but it asks, what are some of the more sophisticated data quality checks you apply to the ESG data you ingest into the firm?
So tri-party recs. So for example, moving away from just checking the single data source and period on period checks, moving to then, okay, if I have three vendors providing me the data set for the same value, right? Are they all giving the same figures? Great. Go and give it a rating, means that we're in line. If 2 out of 3, okay, even better, or better still. If they're all different, okay, that's an issue. I need to then like escalate to the next step. Steps will be then looking at the individual discrepancies between the values, and then actually leveraging some AI tools, which is not, I haven't got that yet, but the plan is, okay, looking at the actual raw source. I can't every single time Google the company's reports to find out the information. So then I want to be able to like identify the security in question, the field in question, and then be able to find the web crawler, find the document, and pull through the relevant information, do a check on that. That bit is an exotic thing that I'm trying to plan. But they're the types of things that you can do. But I think something basic like tri-party checks is very simplistic. But again, there's no point in adding additional vendors if you don't have the fundamentals to start with. So you're just adding complexity. If you can't do this with one vendor, you will struggle to deal with more than one vendor.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I hope that answers your question. And Neil, coming back to you and your experience out there in the field, this one says, as ESG data is integrated into traditional financial data, should an FI still have a dedicated ESG data manager or leader? And how should that role work? I think there's probably a bit of a half and half at the moment, perhaps. But what do you see with your clients? Is it integrated to a great deal? Is there still an ESG lead? How does that seem to work?
I mean, I think this is a mixed bag. I mean, what we see is a lot of the ESG data is being integrated into the providers that they have today for obvious reasons. And I think that goes back to many points that Aria's made about the entity structures and having that data defined at the right level and having that centralized in one location seems to be, the rationale behind having that. And also these systems tend to have capabilities that allow you to standardize and normalize this data much more seamlessly as well, because it's using security information that has been before. So that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And let me come back to Aria. I don't know if you have any experience of this, but do let us know. It says, what are the benefits, challenges, and costs of outsourcing ESG data sourcing and management? Is this something you've looked at?
Well, for us inherently, it's the data vendors. So we source our data from the ESG vendors. The only times that we would source it internally is if we ever need to do an override, or if we need to get more clarity on a particular rating. So they're the only times that we'll probably like, in-source that information. But otherwise, inherently, all data, including fundamental data, ratings data, it's all outsourced.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Either Neil or Angel, do you see that happening with people outsourcing the whole lot and the management of the data?
We see a much more flexible environment now with clients moving maybe across the whole spectrum. So we see that depending on the case, if more on financial institutions, they deal more with private companies or with a small amount of universe, they engage directly with those organizations. So it's like a kind of a self-sufficient on the data provision, but they have the challenges of managing that data and putting all that data together. While on the other side of the spectrum, it might be like very large organizations that deal with like different teams working with different types of needs, in which cases that they need different providers, proprietary data, they have even their own methodologies, etc. And then the level of complexity is much more, as I was mentioning before, right? It's very important that they're able to compare those ones, apply the right rules, etc., etc. So these days, it's true that we see teams that do things pretty internal, even though they need solutions to put it together, and teams that do externally, but outsourcing in coming from different sources.
Okay, thank you. Quick round of everybody this one. So a yes or no and a laugh or a cry is okay. So the question is this ever going to be easy? Neil, would you like to start with that?
I would like to say yes, but I think the answer may be no. We're at the stage now where we're seeing a lot of vendors out there supplying different subsets of data, and as we've seen with traditional market data, we do see the larger vendors kind of winning that over time, and then bringing those in source, and standardization is definitely going to occur. As regulation increases, we will see more standardization. So I definitely think it's going to take time, but I do feel that it's a complex subject. It's a complex problem statement. But I do think that standardization will improve, the overall quality of the data will improve. And I do see, my personal view, the number of data vendors reducing over time as consolidation happens.
Okay, I'm just going to ask this one to Aria again as a practitioner. Is it ever going to be easy?
Well, easy is relative, cop out response, but I think it'll be easier. So right now everyone's learning, everyone's still trying to get to grips with what's happening. The regulators are moving the goalposts, but I think in this case the intention is there. I don't like it to be complicated for no reason, and I think there has been pushback, and the regulators have understood and withheld some of those changes. But I think it will get easier. But another response to that is like, how long have we been using like credit rating information and financial metrics? How many years has that taken to evolve to the point it is now? And still you get certain cases, I would remind people of like an Enron or the GFC, which kind of brings it back into question. So people still need to have that in as a context as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we better stop our audience questions there. Not stop them, but finish on a matter of time. So thank you to our audience for your questions, and thank you very much to the speakers for their answers. Let's move on and run a final audience poll here. It is, what extent of business and operational benefits is your organization gaining or expecting to gain from getting ESG data right? So while you have a think about that and answer the question, let me come over to Angel again to talk about how he sees the business and operational benefits of getting ESG data right, and what happens if it all goes wrong.
For me, clear benefits, I mentioned before. The first one is improve risk management, which is one of the reasons because you use this type of information, right? So you need to understand where the challenges are. And more, we believe that the future challenges of the organizations are going to be related more to non-typically financial topics, as included in ESG frameworks, rather than the traditional purely financial dimensions about assets and so on. For many reasons, I could name thousands of research related to how the brand, the talent, the governance, etc., are affecting the success of companies rather than, in many cases, many other typical dimensions. The second one is about the access to the capital. So you are going to need this in order to, and even in more general terms, to engage and relate to any of the different players in the ecosystems and improve your brand and reputation as the third one, right? So if you do right on these ones, clearly you're going to be in much better position. There are negative sides, of course, if you don't do this well. First one related to the regulation and purely legal implications with penalties. Arya was mentioning Enron case and so on, but related to environmental topics, Volkswagen, Toyota, DWS, so many brands have been affected, especially in the last years, related to topics like greenwashing, misunderstanding of information, etc. That in the end comes back to the opposite of the benefits, right? Not managing this right might be affecting your reputation, might be affecting your risk management, and all in all might be attacking the core business of the organization.
Okay, thank you. Let me come to Neil next on this one. Where do you see the benefits, Neil, if they get it right, and what happens when you go wrong?
Yeah,
what would you say?
I'll echo the points. I mean, access to, from the risk management perspective is what I hear a lot of our clients focus on. Access to the market and improving your reputation is certainly going to improve that for absolute sure. Just to echo really his points. But, what goes wrong and can go wrong is obviously we've seen recently with the ECB possibly looking to find, banks for client failure around their risk management. So, the failure for doing so is actually quite punitive in a way. So having a good sort of business operating footprint around your ESG is really important to your organization, and you really must focus on it. That would be my message.
Okay, thank you. And Arya, what have you experienced there in terms of the benefits you're getting of getting this right and the potential of getting it wrong?
Yeah, I mean, you've got your standard business wins like scalability, your single golden source of data. Last thing you want is like two different metrics, ESG metrics going out for the same security used by a team in Singapore, a team in Sydney. You've got your reduction in grey hair conversion rates. You got trust in the data. But I think again, like for me, going back to the real reasons why I got involved in this space is like, how do you actually make a tangible impact? So for me, I'm a data person, always like data driven. So the accurate data helps make informed decisions. And then with the hope that with those informed decisions, you can shift the focus to areas that need attention. So we've already spoken about capital allocation, or like highlighting like areas of concern with facts and data. So to me, that's where it can go right, because if you have questions on the integrity of the data, then that's all the focus will ever be on. So we want to like shift our focus away from that and actually like, oh no, now we trust the data. Now the data is telling us all this stuff. So what should we be doing about that? And obviously, the converse to that is you get it wrong, it's reputational damage. But again, why we're doing all this is trying to get to address those ESG factors and drive real change.
Okay, fine. Please could we see the poll results and see how our audience is getting on? And Arya, would you like to comment on those? Yeah. Does that seem? What does that look like to you?
I mean, is it? I don't know if it's because some business benefit. Is that because they then don't know what to do, or is it a case of like they've never been in a position using good data, so they don't know what it could unlock? So I think having good data, and again, use examples of any quant teams that you might have internally, any fundamental teams who have had access and exposure to reference data, fundamental data, how they've used that to make decisions. then imagine that's ESG data. So would you still give the same response of like some benefit, or would actually be, no, you see some significant benefit to that? So I think I'll change the narrative and replace ESG data with any other data you currently trust, and then see if that changes the results.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you to our audience for voting. And that leaves us coming to my last question for today. I'd like to ask all our speakers to offer some advice to practitioners working on ESG data sourcing and management. Neil, please, would you kick off here?
Absolutely. As I said, you know, I'd say start small and start from thinking about what are the key data attributes that you need for your key stakeholders within your organization. Start there and then work backwards. So once you have your what I would class as starting target operating model, you know, think about, well, how do I, you know, what do I need to do next? I need to link the data, or I need to establish an entity structure to be able to aggregate this data. What types of quality checks must I do? And do I document those types of quality checks to make sure that the data that I will have eventually is going to do sufficient number of quality checks to meet the needs of the customer base, but also making sure that that has, you know, already mentioned it before, lineage, which is about how do I get to the underlying source of this data from the vendors, from the reports that they may have used to produce this as well. And then think about, on the final stage, what sources of data do I need to actually populate my target operating model? So I would suggest working from the front backwards, and that would be my suggestion.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. Aria, what would you advise?
Very similar. Experiment as much as possible. So, you know, before creating a full-blown plan, you want to make sure that you understand the problems that you're trying to solve for, and it's not a prescriptive thing. So you need to experiment to get the answers that you're looking for. Then look at those tools, and then, you know, to me, the ESG data strategy is fundamental. Like, again, that's your North Star. Everyone's on the same page. Separate it from the rest of the data governance structure and have something dedicated to it, because it is slightly different for now, and you want to make sure that you get enough information before you start. And again, start small with it. Your data strategy does not need to be a massive document. Just start outlining your data quality approach, your vendors, your CDEs, and who are your users. Even if it's as basic as that, it's better than a lot of the other players.
Okay, thank you. And Angel, a few final words from you, please.
Yeah, I'm gonna start agreeing with everything that they said. So those are very interesting pieces of advice. I fully agree on the idea of the strategy. So maybe complementing a little bit, rely on technology. So this thing might look like simple, but things get complicated. CSRD is gonna be requesting more than 1,000 of indicators. So it's gonna be really challenging to try to assume, even though you are a small company, that this is going to be feasible on a manual basis. So rely on technology. Try to be connected to the evolving standards. So understand the problem. Try to be close to that. Thanks to the technology, because the technology simplifies that for you, thanks to external consultants, whatever, but you really need to understand the topic or find the ways to understand the topic. And maybe in a very general definition of data quality, you have mentioned lineage, you have mentioned checks, etc. So ensure that you can somehow prevent and maintain the quality of the data, because based on that is based on where you're gonna make important decisions.
Okay, thank you all very much indeed. So thank you to our speakers and for sharing their expertise and their experience with us today. Thank you too to Alveo and Clarity AI for sponsoring today's webinar. Before we close, just a quick reminder of those 18 group events that I mentioned earlier. On June the 20th, we'll host our first AI and Capital Markets Summit in London. You're very welcome to join us. And on the 26th of September, we'll be back in New York City with our next Data Management Summit. And then on the 18th of July, we'll be covering a webinar on how to maximize the use of data standards and identifiers for the benefit of the business. So hope to see you at one of those. Meantime, that said, that's it for today. So thank you again very much to Neil, Angel and Aria, and thank you to all of you who have taken part in the webinar. Please do complete our feedback forms. We're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.